Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to say, first of all, I'm very happy to have this hearing. I've been among a number of people who've been frustrated with the dominance of politics and the lack of solutions. Today, it looks like we're actually having a discussion about a range of solutions to deal with this issue. I think it couldn't come soon enough. I also want to acknowledge that I think that the concerns raised by my Republican colleagues about foreign policy in India and China are 100% legitimate. We ought to be working on what we can do as a matter of foreign policy to discourage the implementation of the use of coal in particular, but to encourage the use of renewables so that they come along with what we discover here. And I want to talk about two things I'm emphasizing just briefly on. One is super pollutants. I mean, I think one of the things that we've talked about here is that we know natural gas burns cleaner than coal. That's seen as an advantage, but if we lose the benefit because of methane emissions, I think we're hurting ourselves. And the opportunity in methane emissions and with all these short-lived super pollutants is that they are short-lived, so that if you can keep them from getting into the atmosphere, they don't persist like carbon dioxide. You can have a really quick impact, relatively quick impact on the rate of climate change. And so I think that's something that deserves a lot of emphasis here. But I want to talk a little bit about negative emissions technologies, since I think almost all of you address that, and that hasn't gotten a lot of attention. I addressed the first question to Mr. Cohen. One of the concerns about carbon capture technologies is that it's too expensive to implement on a large scale, and moreover, that the technology as it exists today doesn't work as advertised. Ms. Angelski talked about this a little bit, but can you discuss what carbon capture activities are currently taking place in the United States, and what both industry and government are doing to bring down the costs of those carbon capture projects?
Right, I have global numbers, which is that globally there are now 18 fully commercial carbon capture units on industry and power around the world. I believe 5 are under construction, and some 30 are, I'm sorry, and then 20 are in the various stages of development. In the United States, we have at least one very large-scale power example, Petronova project near Houston. Took my board to see it. You can see the CO2 pipe going in the ground. It's actually very instructive to actually say it's actually just a pipe, and it's a bunch of chemical towers. So clearly we can do it. There are dozens of injection projects around the country to prove that we can keep it underground. So the technology, I don't think there's any debate about that. With current technology we can do this and we can store it underground, and there's been lots of monitoring projects. The real challenge is bringing the costs down, and that's just a question of really scale up. It's the solar and wind story, basically. Can you keep driving numbers and numbers and numbers to the point where you get, with the learning by doing, you get to a better price point? The company that did the project in Houston has said that they believe that if they did a second unit, they could bring the cost down 30% just based on what they learned from the first unit. It's just a learning curve problem in our view. So it's going to be a lot of continued support, probably from the federal government and from state governments, to just build that out and get to a point where we're in mass production.
Ms. Angelski, I appreciate you mentioning the Use It Act, which actually has been passed by the Senate, and we could pass it. We could pass it here in the House. It would be great. Can you talk about the role of that in terms of advancing this technology and how you think that might be helpful?
So there's really 2 main components of that bill that I think are really interesting. One is that you are authorizing research for direct air capture as well as for carbon. If you capture carbon and you convert it into some other useful products. And so that to me would really help to accelerate those technologies. And as I said in my testimony, transform the way that we're currently using carbon and create it into marketable products, which is something that would really contribute to the deep decarbonization objectives that we're talking about. The other aspect of that bill would be to streamline permitting for projects, and that would be both for carbon capture project infrastructure, also as well for the pipelines that are needed to move around the CO2.
Just for those people who aren't maybe not familiar with the technology, can you explain what the role of pipelines is in this sector? These are carbon dioxide pipelines.
Sure. So once you need infrastructure to capture carbon dioxide from an industrial flue gas stream, and once you capture it, you have to do something with it.
Right.
And so the most common way of moving CO2 is you pressurize it and you put it into a supercritical state. So it's almost like a liquid fuel. And that typically is moved through pipelines. And as I mentioned in my testimony, we have about 4,500 miles of carbon dioxide pipelines. currently operating in this country, so we have existing infrastructure that we can tap into.
But it needs to be
then-
expanded, right? I'm going to run out of
It
time.
does,
I'll just say, like, I look forward to someday even talking about what else we might do with that carbon, but
Yes.
for the time being, I yield back.